Just a few quick words about the Wagner and some program logistics. For those of you who are new to the Wagner, we are a natural history museum and educational institution located in Philadelphia. We were founded in 1855, just 1 year after Walden was published, and we have a dual mission to teach contemporary science to the public and to interpret and preserve the Wagner's historic building, which is a time capsule, which you can sort of see, of 19th century science. Tonight's talk's just one of many we offer. As it says in our name, the Wagner Free Institute, our programs are all free to make them accessible to the public. We occupy a National Landmark building with a museum, a library, and a historic lecture hall where we would have held this program if it weren't for COVID, but we will be offering future talks back on site and other programs. But the museum is already open to the public and we are doing our daytime programs, so you're welcome to come and visit us. We do record the programs, as you might have heard, and you can catch up on past talks on our YouTube channel. And as I said, the program's open, so you can come in and visit. And we'll be starting new program series in the evening in January. So if you're interested in hearing more about those and staying connected, sign up for our e-newsletter or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It's now my pleasure to welcome our speakers and tonight's moderator, Andrew Blauner. Andrew is a literary agent and editor of 7 previous anthologies, including Coach, 25 Writers Reflect on People Who Made a Difference, The Peanuts Papers, Writers and Cartoonists on Charlie Brown, Snoopy and the Gang, and The Meaning of Life, and In Their Lives, Great Writers on Great Beatles Songs. One of our authors, Gerald Early, is an essayist, cultural critic, and professor of English, African and African American Studies and American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of a number of books, including The Culture of Bruising, which won the 1994 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. James Marcus is the author of Amazonia, 5 years at the epicenter of the dot-com juggernaut, and has also translated from the Italian Giacomo Casanova's The Duel. He's a former editor of Harper's Magazine and has contributed to many others, including New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Guardian, and Best American Essays. He's currently at work on his next book. And Robert Sullivan is the author of 8 books, including Rats, The Meadowlands, and The Thoreau You Don't Know. He's a contributing editor at A Public Space, and he does live here in Philadelphia and teaches at Middlebury College's Threadloaf School of English. Last, a plug for the Wagner. This program, like everything we do, is free, and it's our remarkable mission to make science widely accessible and its history for free. We're at the end of our fiscal year and raising funds through our annual appeal, so we will drop a link into chat if you'd like to make a donation and contribute to support our free programs. To everyone who does contribute, we thank you. It makes it possible for us to do what we do. So please do come in and visit and to come get a signed copy of the book. Now I'm happy to turn the program over to Andrew Blauner and our guest speakers.
Thank you, Susan. This mask, just so everyone knows, is available for purchase at shops at Walden Pond. Whereas this shirt, which was given to me, has the entirety of Walden written on it. And if you'd like to know how to get that, you can message me separately. I want to sincerely thank Susan and everybody at the Wagner. I haven't been to the Wagner, but as we were talking before we got started here, I will be in Philadelphia in the spring, and that will be one of my first stops. I have a 7-year-old son. His favorite subject in school is science, and if I can bring him, and hopefully everything will be safe and sound by then, we'll really look forward to it. But thank you to the Wagner. Thank you to Princeton University Press, specifically Anne Savarese, who is the in-house editor there, and Jody Price, who's the terrific publicist. Thank you to everybody out there who's giving up part of your Wednesday night to spend a little time with us, to all of the contributors, and specifically, I was going to say Professor Early, but Gerald, James, and Bob. Bob and James sort of put their heads together to to come up with the idea to do this event there. And that the catalyst for that was an event we did at the Brooklyn Book Festival. I want to moderate this discussion about as much as I edited the book, just in terms of the nomenclature of it all, which is to say not very much. When you have writers of this caliber, editing is really not what they needed. I just tried to like not mess it up and kind of get out of the way, which is mostly what I want to do here tonight. But a couple of things, and then I'll leave it to the contributors. But the backstory for this book, I think it's a logical inference that given COVID, that this book sort of all came about as a result of or in response to COVID, because as Pagan Kennedy, who's a writer in Boston, said, once the pandemic hit, we're all Thoreau now. And it certainly was a catalyst to move this project forward, but it was a book that I had harbored hopes of putting together for many years, but was just struggling with like excruciating procrastination and not able to move the book to the next level. 20 months ago, I realize it was, I was struggling, as I think a lot of us were, with life and death issues and how were we going to survive? What was life going to be like? How were we going to live? For how long was this going to go on? One of the things I could feel good about investing myself was a project that I thought had substance and meaning and resonance and relevance. And Henry David Thoreau and his life and his work are suddenly felt not just timeless, but timely. The title of the book, as many of you probably know, but for those of you who don't, Now Comes Good Sailing, is the last known full sentence that Thoreau is known to have spoken just before he died. Now comes good sailing. What a concept. We'll never know what he meant. He uttered, I think it was moose and Indian after that, but now comes good sailing was the last full sentence. Part of the mission for me with this book was sort of summed up by the title of one of Bob Sullivan's books, which was The Thoreau You Don't Know. My aspiration was to tell the story, the Thoreauvian story, in a way that has never been told before, through a kind of kaleidoscopic approach, a tapestry of stories from different points of views and perspectives, to go beyond the pond, beyond Walden, the 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days out of a life of 44 years or so, the life before and the life after Walden. Many of the pieces certainly address Walden, as we'll hear tonight. I'll jump back in sort of intermittently, but for the most part now, I really want to get as quickly as possible to these phenomenal writers. And we'll just go in alphabetical order. So I'd like to start with Gerald Early. If you would take the floor or the screen, I will turn it over to you with my thanks.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to share the stage with these other really great writers. I'm really happy to have been in this book with these other really great writers. The one thing I liked about having done a couple of these Zoom things with Andrew is that as a result, I've kind of gotten to meet him because I've worked with him in some other stuff and had never met him. I've in 2 other anthologies of Andrew's. One was on Beatles songs, and writers had to select a Beatles song to write about. And I was in that, and I was also in the Peanut Papers. And but I didn't write about Charles Schulz or Peanuts. I wound up writing about Vince Guaraldi, who wrote the music for the Peanut shows. So this is my 3rd rodeo with Andrew, and I've been very appreciative because he's come to me with projects, ideas that I would not have thought about writing about normally, and that have kind of opened me up in a lot of ways by having the opportunity to do so. So I'm really grateful. This essay that I wrote for this book, Thoreau, is an essay that had some moving parts in it, and it was kind of it's kind of ironical, it's kind of contradictory in its way, because I'm known in some circles for writing some essays about Philadelphia, which is my hometown. I grew up there. I lived there for the first 26 years of my life, 27 years of my life. And this essay is sort of a Philadelphia essay, except it's taking place in San Francisco. But it's sort of a Philadelphia essay because several of the characters in it, important characters in it, it revolve around Philadelphia. But it's taking place in San Francisco. It's an essay about illness, but the people in it do not seem ill. But yet it's an essay about illness, and it's an essay about people who really are conscious of being ill in a way, or injured in a way, or wounded in a way, because they're all sort of ex-civil rights workers. They're all people who had been in an organization called SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My sister was in it. So they were all people who had been very active in the civil rights movement earlier in the 60s, either in northern cities or in the South. And they were kind of burnt out, and they wound up in San Francisco. And so it's kind of a funny essay in that way, in that it's moving in a certain way that you wouldn't be expecting, that it's Philadelphia, but it's San Francisco. It's illness, but it's also people who don't seem ill in many respects. And it's about nature, although it's set in a city, and it's very urban, but it's really about nature. So in this way, there were these moving parts in it that had to be kind of reconciled, which, I tried my best to sort of reconcile them in the writing of the essay. But it was these kind of contradictory things about it that made it very interesting for me to write it. And also because I got a chance to say some things about my sister, who is my late sister, that I wanted to say. And I also got a chance to play a role that I wanted to play with her, which is the sort of the ingenue, because I'm in this sort of innocent, the ingenue. She's the one who's the leader. And I wanted to explore that aspect of our relationship because it was very important to me. I wrote this essay after she died, so it gave me a chance to sort of think about a few things about her influence on me. So the interesting thing about all of this is that it's an essay about race, and in some ways it's an essay not about race. And the people who I was around when I lived with my sister in San Francisco were all ex-SNCC people, and all of them had gone to college, and all of them had read Thoreau. And because they read Thoreau in college, they were highly educated people, and they were highly literate people. They exposed me to a lot of things, and their take on Thoreau was very interesting because he was a topic of real conversation at this time. This was in 1969, and Thoreau was kind of in a vogue, had a vogue in the late 1960s. Everybody was sort of talking about, following the drummer and all this sort of stuff, and all the quotes that become cliches. I mean, they were all on posters and stuff like that. It was very popular stuff about Thoreau at this time. Reading Walden was a big discovery for many people at this time. It was part of the hippie movement. I mean, it spoke to many different kind of people who were trying to opt out of what they thought was bourgeois culture. It spoke to them. It spoke to white hippies. It spoke to Black revolutionaries. It was amazing to me to discover how many kinds of people, young people, this book spoke to. And so part of my essay is sort of recapturing that moment of how this book is speaking to the culture and how this book is speaking to various people who are trying to find another way of understanding what it means to be an American, which is what this all kind of comes down to in a way. So that was sort of what my approach was. And I purposely decided to concentrate on Walden because I knew all the Black people I was around had read the essay on civil disobedience. And, they had a take on that, and they had an understanding of that. And I purposely wanted to stay away from that and Thoreau the abolitionist and so forth, because I wanted to concentrate on one, illness, and the other thing I wanted to concentrate on was nature. And I thought it would be interesting to write an essay where I'm talking about how Black people are conceiving or trying to understand nature, especially trying to understand or conceive nature when you're not living in anything that people understand as nature, when you're living in this very urban setting, and when you're very, and Black people at this point, which is 1969, 1970, have extremely urbanized people. The transformation of them becoming this extremely urban people was a fascinating transformation. And by 1970, Black people had become majority urban people, had become among the most urban people in the country. In fact, when the word urban was used, it kind of, when people use urban, it was a stand-in word for Black people and things like that. So I wanted to explore the idea of nature with Black people in this way. So that basically is sort of what I was trying to do in the essay. I wouldn't say the essay was exactly fun to write. It was a challenge to write it in a lot of ways. It didn't come easily, but it came eventually, but it didn't come easily. And so I was, on the whole, I was pretty pleased with it. If you like, I can, do I still have time or is my time up?
You have time.
Oh, okay. I'll read a short part from the beginning if you like. The essay is in two parts, and the first part starts out with a lyric from a song, "But I'm no longer blind, my friend," is the lyric. I first encountered Walden and Henry David Thoreau in a significant way in 1969 when I went to live with my oldest sister, Lenore, in San Francisco. I suppose the time, the place, the circumstances, and the book were a perfect convergence. It seemed almost fated. In San Francisco at the time were hippies, the Black Panthers. My sister took me to a Black Panther rally in Golden Gate Park, anti-Vietnam War activists, and assorted leftists, old and new, a lot of burnt out young Black ex-civil writers, among whom numbered my sister, and a certain sense of utter dislocation, as if the nation had not recovered from 1968 and the Tet Offensive, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the race relations that resulted from King's assassination, the race rebellions that resulted from King's assassination, and the police riots during the Democratic Party's national convention in Chicago. When I passed a newsstand around Market Street and Van Ness Avenue one sunny, cool morning and saw a newspaper headline about the moon landing, I thought the nation had not recovered even from the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It seemed sad that he was not around for this major event that was part of his vision for the new generation he represented. What an irony that the man Kennedy defeated for the presidency in 1960 was now president. And now Nixon, resurrected from the political dead, was calling for law and order when in fact a certain sort of law and order, corrupt and illegitimate, was in good measure responsible for the mayhem and despair. Everywhere was declension. It was even sadder in August when the papers on the same newsstand headlined the Manson family murders. Even the hippies, the flower, free love, and incense crowd were psychopathic. Everything seemed shot to hell. But San Francisco at that time was a pretty hell to be condemned to, or a very pretty anteroom to wait in until hell arrived. Geography is therapy if it is sufficiently picturesque. And all of this, Walden, as it turned out, was a good fit.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you very much. And you just put on display why I think of you for pretty much every book I try to put together. True Renaissance man, whether it was, as you say, the Beatles or Peanuts, or I just rewatched the Ken Burns baseball series, which you're more than a talking head on and an expert there. And just a quick point, you mentioned the Beatles and Peanuts. I was watching some of the Beatles documentary now, and I was thinking when we did the Peanuts book, it was, I think, the 80-year, 70-year anniversary of Peanuts. When we did the Beatles book, it was the 50-year anniversary of Sergeant Pepper. And the questions arose of, are we in a new Beatles moment? Are we in a new Peanuts moment? Or has it just been one long 50-year, 70-year? With Thoreau, it feels kind of similar. It's not a paradox. It's just, it begs this question of like, because of the pandemic, is Thoreau resonating more or more strongly now? Or has it just kind of always been there and it's just sort of magnified more? It's a rhetorical question for now, but maybe we can address in the time toward the end. So thank you again, Gerald. So now I want to move to James Marcus, who, when your bio was read, it didn't mention, and maybe you prefer it that way, but the book on which you're working and have been working, which I'm greatly anticipating, eager to read, is about Emerson, which, aside from my admiration and respect for your work in general as a writer and an editor, was one of the reasons I thought of you specifically for this project. And I was rewarded with a piece that did part of what the agenda for this book was to do, which was to explicate, to manifest a side of Thoreau that a lot of people didn't know about. So with that sort of table setting, if I can turn it over to you, James, to talk to us a bit.
Sure. Like Gerald, I was, very thrilled to be invited to contribute to this book. I imagined there would be, more than one piece about Thoreau as a great writer and Thoreau as a prophet of environmentalism and Thoreau as an apostle of civil disobedience as well. And those are great topics, and those are many of the reasons we admire Thoreau and love him. But I wanted to, find a perhaps less well-known aspect of Thoreau. And because I had been stuck in this 7-year-long quagmire with Emerson, I had read quite a lot and thought quite a lot about Thoreau's relationship to Emerson and also to Emerson's wife, Lydian. It's, I guess, somewhat widely known that Thoreau did live in the Emerson household on 2 different occasions for extended periods. And during the first of these, he did form a very close rapport with Lydian Emerson, who was Ralph Waldo Emerson's second wife. I'm not suggesting for one moment that these people were likely to have had a sexual relationship, let alone a traditionally romantic relationship, but it's clear from letters that Thoreau wrote to Lydian after he left that household the first time that he had a very intense emotional rapport with her. We don't have the letters she wrote in response, but we do have the ones that he wrote. And, I think they're far beyond the kind of very lofty and effusive language of friendship that was common then. I mean, people who were not lovers spoke to each other with a very exalted vocabulary, but that may be part of what's going on here, but there's something else. There's again, an emotional intensity that is very unusual. And in a way, there was a second chapter of that, because after Thoreau emerged from Walden during his 2 years plus there, Emerson was going off on a lecture tour of England, which turned out to be 8 or 9 months long, I think. And although the relationship between the 2 men had frayed a little bit, he invited Thoreau to move into the household during the time he was away and be a kind of pinch hitting paterfamilias and help Lydian run the household. And Thoreau agreed to do that. And I think there was a deepening of their relationship. And in a way, because Thoreau was a great favorite of the Emerson children, he was in a way a much more fun and playful father than the father who was usually, on site. And the children actually said to Thoreau, one of them, Edward Emerson, said, "Would you be my father, Mr. Thoreau?" And Thoreau, of course, reported this remark to Emerson in a letter, and said in various other ways, "You must come back or you will soon be usurped," or something like that. So I feel there's a little bit of goading there. Emerson, typically a very lofty person, seems not to have risen to the bait. He did come back, and Thoreau left that household forever. So I was just very drawn to this episode, which I already knew a bit about from my Emerson research, because we just don't think of Thoreau much as a romantic or erotic creature in a lot of ways. He was much more of a social being than he's often given credit for. He had many, many friends, and he loved being around people, actually, and socializing. But aside from some earlier romantic relations that sort of blew up on the launch pad when he was quite young and before he developed this relationship with Lydian, there really isn't much hint of it. And indeed, although he had a very sensual relationship to the physical world, he had a very disquieting and sort of dubious relationship to his own physicality. He didn't trust his own body. He didn't feel comfortable with it. And it's most likely that he never had what we would think of as a romantic or a sexual relationship in his entire life. But I found it very humanizing to take a look at something that was in its own way very, very sui generis, a very Thoreauvian way of having an intense relationship with someone of the opposite sex. And again, I think it's just very humanizing of him. You know, he could be a very lofty and sometimes a cantankerous personality himself on the page and in real life, but his heart was malleable and he was emotionally open to people. And in this case, he did form just a very intense relationship with someone who was incidentally married to his mentor and his best friend in the world. So you can only imagine some of the internal complications that he probably went through during this time, which he did not really set down on paper. But as I said, I wanted to look at that facet of him, and that's what I came up with. So.
And James, thank you very much for that. And I just want to stay with you for one moment to just as a follow-up to that. Is it fact that Thoreau and his brother John, who was as important to his life as anyone, I think we'd say, that he and John each proposed to the same woman?
Yeah, I mean, that's a zany episode that even preceded what I'm talking about now. And I mean, to make it zanier, Thoreau, when he returned to Concord after college, after Harvard, was very taken with an 11-year-old boy named Edmund Sewell, to whom he wrote a very effusive and, let's say, platonically romantic poem, I believe called Sympathy, which was later published in the Dial. Now, again, this wasn't in any way a consummated relationship. I'm not suggesting that Thoreau was a pedophile. He was just very taken with this child. But then after that, both he and his brother John wooed Edmund Sewell's older sister, whose name was Ellen Sewell. I think she was around 17 at the time. And they both were, going after her romantically. John Thoreau went to Scituate, Massachusetts, where she lived, and actually took her for a walk on the beach at one point, proposed to her, and she accepted his proposal. And then a few days later, she broke off that proposal, saying that she actually liked Henry more of the two brothers. But she married neither of them. She married a Unitarian clergyman named, I think, Joseph Osgood in the end. And then Thoreau became friendly with that family as well. So these people really knew how to do the kind of zigzagging and somewhat inexplicable, romantic behavior. But yes, he did compete with his beloved older brother for this woman, whom neither of them married in the end, of course.
Right. And it's funny, when I started doing research, due diligence about this project, one of the things that came up as a theory was that part of what catalyzed Thoreau going to Walden into the woods was that he had proposed to this woman and she rebuffed him, and he was then renouncing society, which turns out to have no basis in truth from everything else read. It was a nice fiction. Okay, so thank you, James. So now Robert or Bob Sullivan, who, how do I put this? When I first started putting the idea for this book together, 3 people independently said, oh, you got to talk to Bob Sullivan. You should definitely have Robert Sullivan in the book. And I didn't need them to tell me that, because I had already read his book and loved it, which again is called The Thoreau You Don't Know, which for all intents and purposes might have been the name of this book had it not already been used in Bob's book. But he, was a natural for this book. You never know what you're going to get. But what we got was really something special and unusual. And I'll turn it over to Bob to let him sort of talk about whatever he wants to talk about, or read from it, or contextualize it. But over to you, Bob.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be in good company, sailing with so many good pieces, good writers, obviously. I'm trying to think if, I guess you have a much better title. This is a much better title. My title is a mistake. It was a mistake. Perhaps the whole book was a mistake. A lot of what I do is based on mistakes. I make mistakes. I try to fix them. It gets worse. But, and one of the problems with writing a book that, with the title, like A Thoreau You Don't Know, it already, the idea is there that you're going to like try to correct something or tell somebody something that they don't know. That's a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. So I guess I'll formally apologize here at the Wagner Free Institute. But because people in something about America, if I may speak candidly about America for just 1 second, is that America thinks it's in on the joke. It's in on the secret. America often thinks that they already know, when it's kind of a big cultural figure, and there's a sort of side note about that figure. He actually lived near the pond. It wasn't wilderness. When America thinks they know that already, so when you go to them and say, actually Thoreau this or that or the other thing, they say, yeah, you don't have to tell me. I know he was a selfish guy who didn't really live in nature, and it's all kind of cheating and a lie. So there's no way you can correct certain things. I should say that I came to Thoreau very backwards. I mean, I got some high school Thoreau, I guess. I kind of got into American landscape painting in college, and so thinking about writing in nature and things like that. But I was writing books about swamps and kind of abandoned spaces and polluted spaces and abused spaces, devastated landscapes. And at one point I was out on a reservation on the Macaw Nation, and there was a whale hunt going on, and some animal rights protesters came in, and they were protesting a Native American tribe kind of reasserting its right to hunt a whale. And one day the animal rights protesters had to leave this protest that they were quite vehement about. And I said, where are you going? And they said, well, we're going back to Seattle. We have exterminators coming today. And I said, exterminators at your, that was sort of, I said, are you going to like trap and release them? They said, no, they're not mice, they're rats. I know you're saying, well, what does this have to do with Thoreau? But eventually I thought, I should write that rats are the line in nature. That's the line between what is kind of urban or city, or what that, not nature, and what's nature. Rats are right there on the line. I'll write a nature book about rats, and it'll confuse people, which of course is really my only hope, if can't certainly tell anybody anything. So anyway, when I go to write the rats book, I think I'll model it after something. What should I model it after? I'll model after the most perfect nature book that anyone knows, and that would be Walden. So I start to dig into Walden, and I'm going to make a joke. I'm going to follow rats for a year. I'm going to make a joke on Walden. And as I start to dig through Walden deeper and deeper into Walden, I realize the book's a joke. He's 3 jokes ahead of me. So I start to understand that Walden is not about a faraway place, and Walden is not doing what I think it's doing. And Walden is not a biography of him or an account of his year, a per se account. Walden's something else. So that's when I started to write a book about this called The Thoreau You Don't Know, which you don't have to buy because it's a much better collection of essays, because as James is saying, it sort of gives more exposure to more different kinds of Thoreaus than one writer can do. But also, as Gerald is saying, Thoreau gets taken places by people who go places with Thoreau. And that's more interesting than any one person sort of saying where they went with Thoreau. but so when Andrew came back to ask me to do this, one of my first thoughts was, among my many first thoughts, was, oh no, are you kidding me? Like again? Like why would I bang my head against the wall and talk about Thoreau again? But then I thought, okay, I'll do the kind of my main sort of problem. I'll try to identify the sort of primal problematic situation. And I guess I can sum that up. Hopefully I'm wrapping up here by saying that oftentimes when you get your, I think I have my copy of Walden around here somewhere. When you get your copy of Walden, it comes in the old, collection and what is this? This is the Modern Library, and it has Walden and other writings. So it has a little bit of, I think it has the Merrimack book, and it has Civil Disobedience. So Civil Disobedience kind of comes with Walden. You have to read both of them. Everybody knows the Civil Disobedience about the night he spent in jail. And even though Emerson thought it was just ridiculous and out of control that he spent in jail, I don't want to get into the Emerson Thoreau thing right now. I know James had a lot to say about Thoreau, and I was muted the whole time. But anyway, and Emerson is maybe part of the reason why we have to say the Thoreau you don't know. I'm not going to go there. Anyway, they come as a kind of companion, Walden and Civil Disobedience. And I argue in this essay that we actually have it backwards. Everybody thinks that Walden is a kind of how-to book. Oh, I'll get a cabin and I'll build out in the woods and I'll get a coffee mug and I'll put a picture of a bird on it. It'll be amazing. And I'll get in touch with myself. I'll step away. Despite the fact that Walden is about sort of reconnecting. Anyway, the other book on the other side is, this is like a ridiculous thing that he did. He went to jail. So the Civil Disobedience is actually a how-to book, I would argue. And the Walden is an artwork. It's an art piece. It's a thing. It's like an album or like a painting or like a kind of box that you would get into. And the idea is that you enter into this thing, which uses all the tropes and all the sort of, sayings and even the sort of aspirations of the day. Many of his friends are going off to utopian, places to kind of live on farms and only eat this and not eat that, and spend only this much and eat only these weeds and not those things. Everyone's saying, I'm a vegetarian. Well, you're a vegetarian, I'm a this. So he kind of takes all of these things and combs it into this piece that uses an I, which is his I, but is not his I at the same exact time. A very hard thing to talk about and explain, but really not that hard at all. And it uses it to make this art, this art piece. Civil Disobedience was not originally called Civil Disobedience. I think a lot of people know that. It was called Resistance to Civil Government. Resistance is a key word because in his biography, one of the things that Thoreau is an engineer who works with the family pencil company to kind of make the best selling, because it kind of worked the best for artists and surveyors, pencil in America. He invents the way to inject the lead in the middle by studying German pencil engineering. But so when he uses the word like resistance, he's using it as an engineer and a poet at the same time. He's being exactly engineered and exactly poetic. And the idea that word gets taken out in the books that we read, when we read Civil Disobedience today, is really, really sad, because he wanted to get a piece into the machinery to screw up the machinery. And this is one of the many reasons why Walden keeps coming back, why Walden has, I don't want to say as many lives as the Beatles, because I really don't know how many lives the Beatles are going to have, but anyway, keeps coming back. And so we get to see this amazing circle whereby Ellery Channing hands over some Vedic scriptures to him to read, to Thoreau to read. So he kind of takes in this particular kind of philosophy. Then he writes his book with a lot of different kind of philosophies. And then Walden, rather Civil Disobedience or Resistance to Civil Government, gets picked up by Gandhi and printed in his paper. And then we see Martin Luther King going to read that, and people from SNCC and CORE reading that stuff to try to figure this out. So then I have a friend who has worked very closely archiving the freedom fighters, the Freedom Riders. And so the chant when they got into Jackson was bail, no jail. Why? Because that was the stick in the engine of civil government, which Thoreau would say is not civil at all. Every day, the government is, perpetrating horrible atrocities that no one is caring about, even though they claim to care about all kinds of things. They care about, kind of slavery in the West, but not about there's the Underground Railroad, and then there's the, to get people out of slavery, but then there's a railroad that's also going to bring people back into slavery at the same time, and no one is standing up for this in Massachusetts, or not as many people as Thoreau would have. But anyway, that's the stick in government that makes the machine break. And so by the end of his life, he's defending John Brown most vigorously, most eloquently. And he has, just as, for instance, Martin Luther King has, or other people have, he switched to a higher gear of resistance. And yet we use the book on the other side, Walden, to say, he didn't really go, his mother did his laundry. We can discount him. So we can discount the radical Thoreau, all the more better, because we're able to, because we're able to say that this guy, he wasn't really a vegetarian. I think he ate a muskrat, so that's basically what I'm trying to say in this piece, which is that think of it as an artwork that you kind of step into and you come out as another thing, maybe, and then see where that takes you. I'm ceasing and desisting.
Thank you. Several things in sort of reverse order. You mentioned the mother did his laundry. There's some hashtag, or probably it should have its own. When I was trying to sell this project, and thankfully Princeton bought it, Thoreau was trending on Twitter. And it was because someone had, I think, to your point, in a way, thought that they had unearthed something that maybe everyone didn't know. It's not the story you think you know, that his mother did his laundry. You mentioned the night in jail. I want to ask you, as I asked James, about the fact or fiction. Is it factual? Do you know, the story goes that the night that he was in jail, that Emerson went to see him and said, whatever he addressed him as, Henry, or what are you doing in there? And Thoreau reportedly said, what are you doing out there? As sort of,
I'm gonna just immediately go right over to James for two reasons. One, I'm not, I mean, I have all my Thoreau log books and stuff where I was, so James is probably fresher at this. But I'll wait to respond to whatever James says. But I will say that the Thoreau laundry thing is more interesting when you know that his mother's house is a boarding house, because there's been a huge depression, 1837. Nobody recovers of it for decades, and also that there are the Irish, famine refugees, I guess you'd say, who his mother, some of whom his mother has taken in, who Thoreau writes quite disparagingly of in Walden when he's using these tropes, but who Thoreau kind of changes his mind on later on, when he's later, writing letters for Irish, workers and so forth. Okay, I'm stopping. So James, true or false, the Emerson thing? I think, yeah.
I think that, well, I think, as I said to Andrew when we discussed this at the other event, that actual exchange may be apocryphal, but I think it's a very reasonable representation of the feelings of the two men then about political activism. I believe that Emerson thought that Thoreau's night in jail, I think he described it as mean and skulking. So he wasn't very positive about it. But a part of the reason he went to jail because he refused to pay his poll tax in Concord. One of the reasons he wouldn't pay the poll tax is that he disapproved of the war with Mexico and the expansionism that bit off a huge part of the Mexican Empire and made it American. Emerson despised that as a political event. He said it would be like a man who took arsenic, and which brought him down and killed him in the end. So their views of it were not that far apart, but Emerson at that point in his evolution was not much of a political activist. He became much more of one later on. So you do get a snapshot at that moment of the ways in which the two men disagreed about the role of activism in their lives. I believe that during his night in jail, Thoreau got hot chocolate and some toast or something, and
His laundry done.
and probably he had his laundry done as well. So no, I mean, but the laundry thing exists very certainly on the web in particular, and very much on Twitter as a periodic beast that sort of rears its head out of that particular Loch Ness. And once again, Thoreau gets dragged over the whole laundry thing, and then a whole mass of other non-facts are attached to that, including that Walden was literally in Emerson's backyard, and that Thoreau took every meal at Emerson's house, and they did barbecue and drank beer on the lawn. And I mean, none of that is true. And as I learned, there's also no point in trying to march in there and attend to the facts, because you're simply sucked into a social media whirlpool, which is the whole point of it in the first place. So I was, literally sitting at my computer like an idiot, posting maps of Concord on Twitter and arguing how far away the cabin was from Emerson's house. And that was exactly the kind of idiocy that, what the whole thing was set up for. It's like a Venus flytrap for idiots like me. So, and eventually I stopped. I mean, I just said, I don't know why I did this. But a great antidote to that, I would just say, is Rebecca Solnit wrote a very good piece about the whole business around Thoreau and his laundry. And I would advise doubters to look at that and to just say finally that Thoreau was well aware that he was not in the middle of the wilderness, that Walden itself was a kind of amazing piece of performance art. And he didn't feel ashamed at all about walking into town to have dinner with his family, to socialize with people, to have 30 people at once to his cabin for a watermelon party. I mean, he was well aware of what he was doing, no matter who was doing his laundry.
I'll second your point about Rebecca Solnit's piece. In fact, this book was originally going to have a few reprints of previously published pieces, and that was otherwise going to be in there something by Emerson, John McPhee, others. As it turns out, it's all originally commissioned pieces, but that's a stellar one by Rebecca. Also, you've gotten me thinking, we're talking about the Beatles, I'm thinking about Thoreau and Emerson and Lennon and McCartney, and which is who in that paradigm. And also the story, my best friend is a guy named Jim Solomon, who is a filmmaker, and he likes to tell stories, as he puts it, the story that you think you know. And he made a documentary called The Witness, which was nominated for an Academy Award, all about the Kitty Genovese story, which is, as many of you may know, it took place in 1963, a woman who was attacked in Queens, New York. I literally read about it in a textbook in college, and sometimes people know the name immediately. Other times I start to tell the story. She was attacked, and they finish the sentence and they say, and nobody helped. And it became this iconographic, if that's a word, this kind of emblematic story, which turned out not to have been true. That it wasn't it was a morality tale. That this episode we were talking about reminds whether Thoreau actually said to Emerson, "What are you doing out there?" You're saying whether it's apocryphal or not, in some way, it speaks to a sensibility that it's, and the part I focus on there too is, and what I love about this combination of the three of you and your pieces in here is that it takes up again some of the issues that Thoreau is not known for, that his life as a romantic, his sense of humor, which I think it's almost completely overlooked. And I think Bob has spoken to that. I want to give a little time to the three of you, while maybe the audience is thinking of questions they may have. If any of you want to address each other, there were some hints that you might. I know Jim and Bob, you know each other. James and Bob, you know each other, but is there anything you want to sort of question, challenge, encourage each other on? If not,
I mean, I want to say that I should say that Emerson is like, the sun. Like Emerson is amazing because and just if you look who he's inspired writers into the 20th, 21st century. But certainly Thoreau is treated like George. I want to say that. And yet George, we all know All Things Must Pass is the biggest selling Beatles album afterwards. So sorry, Emerson. But
Isn't Bronson Alcott a Ringo figure of a kind?
Oh.
yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm just because as I was saying to Gerald earlier, I went in and read a long time ago when I moved to Philadelphia, or a while back when I moved to Philadelphia, I became very interested in Cecil B. Moore and trying to meet people who knew him and stuff, and finally found a piece or a chapter that in a book that Gerald wrote in particular about him. And I think there's that really interesting in Philadelphia in the 60s. So when I did my Rats book, which I'm sure sounds kind of ridiculous to many people out there, Rats, but I really tried to make it, the secret about that book is don't tell anyone. It's not really about rats. It's about people and groups of people in cities and how people organize and communicate. And in 1963, my mother was pregnant with me and was arrested because she was walking through a protest to get to my father's printing shop. And she was arrested at this rent strike protest at City Hall, New York. And so I'd like to think I was at this protest. She was put in a van, a paddy wagon, as they refer to it. And anyway, it was for the largest rent strike in the history of the United States that's so rarely talked about. And it was a huge rent strike. And it was 1963. And in this time, 63, 64, there are these really amazing things going on in terms of thinking about resistance to civil government. And I think that's why Cecil B. Moore is really interesting to me, because he's making this Emerson Thoreau. There's this Emerson Thoreau thing where Emerson and a lot of people are saying, slow down here. And meanwhile, Thoreau's saying, no, we have to go faster, especially since here at the cusp of the Mexican War. I mean, when Thoreau's about to die, they say he's the only one in Concord who's happy that we're going to war over slavery. But he's being told to calm down with this John Brown stuff. And I just think there's really that contrast, I think it plays out in well, I don't know. That's, you see what I'm leaning towards, asking you already. But your thoughts?
Well, I just want to fact check myself for parenthetically. I said Kitty Genovese was 1963. It was actually 1964.
Okay.
Kennedy was shot November 63. Kitty Genovese was killed March of 1964, for those.
Well, I think because I think Girard, the Girard College in Philadelphia, I think Girard himself was friends with Wagner and kind of set up the institute. There was some coordination there. So I think it's relevant just in terms of, Philadelphia and resistance to problematic government. I was just wondering what you thought.
James?
Are you asking me?
Well, no, Gerald.
I thought you were asking Gerald.
Yeah. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted, Gerald.
Sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Well, I think that the Thoreau that I was initially introduced to in the earlier part of the 60s was almost exclusively the Thoreau that was the civil disobedience, and also John Brown. Those were the first things I learned about him. I hadn't read anything, but those were the first things I read about him. And I would say in Philadelphia, Cecil B. Moore and the whole Girard College thing represented a resistance in Philadelphia that hadn't happened before in that way. And what made it very interesting was that Moore was the head of the NAACP, and the NAACP was not generally known as a protest organization or a resistance organization in the way that maybe SNCC might have been known at the time, or CORE might have been known at the time, or something like that. that the NAACP was a more establishment type of organization. So the fact that more transformed this image of the NAACP to this resistance organization was quite fascinating. He wasn't unique because there were some other Black people who led local chapters of NAACP in other places that also was doing resistant type stuff. But in Philadelphia, it was quite transformative about the whole resistance thing and the whole business of generating people around this institution, Girard College, the whole idea of when you were speaking before about wanting to throw, I don't know, a shoe in the machine or a spike in the machine, the whole idea of throwing the spike or something in the machine by breaking a will. The whole thing was we want to break this guy's will.
Wow.
And it took some time to do that, but ultimately it happened. And it was, I think, demonstrated to people about, if you want to look at it symbolically, about the legacy of slavery and everything. Oh, this can be broken. You can transform this. You can change this.
I suppose we should tell anybody visiting from another city that Girard College didn't allow Black students.
Right. It was a school started by Stephen Girard for orphan boys, and he specifically said in his will it was orphan white boys who could go to Girard College. And so I knew about Girard College because my father died. My mother was a widow, and my mother would always tell me, "You could have gone to Girard College if you were."
Yeah.
And that is though I was something that I was really desiring to do. I said, yeah, I really want to go to Girard. But that was something that resonated just with me personally, that, you know, my mother was always saying to me, and my mother was part of the protest. My family was very activist and they were all part of the protest, so forth. But this whole idea that you were bringing up about resistance to civil government and so forth, that was the Thoreau that got talked about among college students at this time in Philadelphia around Girard College. And Girard College was this very important moment of resistance because nothing like that had quite happened in Philadelphia on that level of persistence, because it took years for this to change, and the persistence of people marching around that college every weekend was really quite something. It was inspiring in a lot of ways. The persistence of it was inspiring.
And am I wrong to think that there was this group that said, let's not resist that way. Let's not do it that way. Let's do it this way. They calm down kind of thing?
Yeah, there were people like that. You know, there were leaders like that. You know, the main one in Philadelphia who didn't like the protest was a guy, a very, very influential Black man, lawyer, a man I actually greatly admired, Raymond Pace Alexander. And Raymond Pace Alexander was the opposite of Cecil B. Whistler. You know, he was the other guy. And, you know, he was the guy who said, oh man, you know, I don't like that. You know, for him, it was like, this is like a lot of performance art. You know, it's like, you know, why are you out here doing this? Why are you getting these people all stirred up about this? You got these people all doing, you know, and for more, of course, that was the whole point of it. The performance art aspect of it was the whole point of it. That was one of the reasons why you're doing it. Everybody knew it was a kind of performance. And that's what made it important. And that's what made it dramatic and and powerful for people. The fact that people knew it was a performance. And even the cops who would be out there by the busloads when they had these marches around the school, they knew it was a performance too. I mean, everybody understood what this was. But Raymond Pace Alexander represented this other, this other thing. It was a very interesting moment in Philadelphia because Raymond Pace Alexander, who was a very respected man and a man that I, had a lot of admiration for in many ways. The 60s was a turning over of a generation. That was the other thing that made Thoreau so powerful with a lot of Black people who read him was when he talked about this whole thing about the old generation. You know, you need to discard the old generation. You don't listen, you know, you don't need to listen to those people. You know, you need to discard them. You know, the old generation is coming up with all their failures that they want to put on you. They want to put their failures all on you. That's the burden of history. They're putting their failures on you.
Yeah.
Don't let them do that. And I think that moment was very dramatically played out with Cecil Moore versus Raymond Pace Alexander and the whole business of Girard College, because Raymond Pace Alexander represented the old way, and people had left the old way. But that was a very powerful message in Thoreau at that time. I think more so than anything else among the young Black people I was with was the idea of the emergence of this new generation that was going to that was not going to accept the failures of the old generation.
I mean, I can't recall how many times I've said to myself as like a private mantra since Trump was elected to the White House, that line of Thoreau's was just like, if you feel that the behavior of civil society and government is so reprehensible, he just says, let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine.
Yeah.
And he doesn't tell you how to do it. You know, he's not defining that narrowly. He's defining it as broadly as possible by saying, like, let your life and how you live be a kind of spoke in the wheel, you know, and a way to slow it down. And I found that really heartening over the last few years to just keep it in mind, because the machine looked pretty bad, worse than usual in recent years. And I love that line, but it seemed to me in the situation you're describing, Gerald, that which it seems a little bit of a classic respectability politics versus
Yes, that's exactly
radicalism, you know, which is present in Black politics in America and in other versions of politics in America. There's always going to be that tug of war, and you know, in a way, it seems best to remember that like both of those things can accomplish something.
Yeah,
they're both a kind of counter friction.
Yeah,
but particularly when you're young, you're impatient with the respectability side of the fence.
Of course, the idea that Thoreau dies, he dies in the middle of the Civil War, right? Or just as it started.
I thought he died in 1860.
So right before the Civil War.
Yeah.
started.
And so, but violence appears to be happening. But you know, I had to write this thing out. I mean, I got to write another thing out. You know, for somebody who's like, what would Thoreau do? Which again, why would I answer that question? Why would I answer? But because I have a problem, obviously, that's why. But anyway, I've just said this little thing. If you were to book Thoreau on the Today Show, and you know, one of the things about Thoreau is, I mean, if you do get into this machine, which he, you know, again, he uses all these self-help book phrases, you know, of the time. He lulls you into this kind of rhythm. That's why I loved, you know, I loved the Church of Coltrane, like the idea that you go to a place to fall into something and see what happens with that. And actually I talk a lot about John Cage in this piece, in the Good Sailing collection. And there's a guy named Julian Eastman, who's a musician, who kind of upsets Cage with how experimentally he handles Cage's pieces. And there's a piece by him that sounds a lot like it's almost like they're almost like mantras, and you fall into them. But anyway, this idea too of Thoreau as celebrity is horrifying. My favorite Thoreau essay is where he presents on the science of pine succession, and he does it at the county fair, and he's speaking to the farmers, and the farmers came. All the farmers came, because if you were still there and hadn't left because or were killed by tuberculosis, or left because the economy was dead and everybody was leaving Concord, if you're still there, you're a farmer and you're working hard. And Thoreau probably surveyed your land, and you knew him because he was interested in the same kind of stuff you were interested in. He knew the rivers. He was working lawsuits for all kinds of people, checking the river levels and so forth. So when he stepped into that crowd, it wasn't like, oh, you're not actually a academic and you didn't do your laundry. It was like, oh, here's a guy who studied the trees, just pure and simple, not magic, but actual, deep concentration and patience, which is, secretly magic. So anyway, the idea of Thoreau as a celebrity, I love that. So if you were to book Thoreau on the Today Show, coming up a chat with the Back to Land pioneer, and then the summer blockbuster everybody's talking about, or for an interview with the New York Times, we sat down for a lunch of locally grown greens to get his take on tiny houses, zero carbon airlines, and a new breed of celebrity climate activists. Then you would notice that Thoreau, that while the interviewers were asking Thoreau for his take on global warming, he'd be asking you about the war, that is the Civil War. You tell him it was over, of course, that Union troops beat the Confederates, but he'd ask questions. You'd mention that while Reconstruction started out with good intentions, the North, with the encouragement of Northern politicians and businessmen, withdrew the troops necessary to enforce it, thereby looking away as a guerrilla war was waged against the formerly enslaved, who in the North and the South were now confined in what were called ghettos, even if they weren't, and murdered mercilessly. Their neighborhoods eventually circled and read by the government and then, quote unquote, abandoned until the banks and developers returned to develop the old neighborhoods away. Thoreau would notice quickly that it sounds like the South won. And as he learned that goods are bought and sold at a one-click pace that has the smell of military logistics, as he learned that employees weaponize time when it used to be an experience, and that energy companies attack the earth to power a mechanized world that only devours itself further, he'd say it sounds as like there's still a war going on. So, I do think that for me, the whole time during the Trump times, it's like, whoa, that phrase too is so helpful, but it's also like, whoa, the Mexican War, we took all that land, Louisiana Purchase. Nobody asked those people if they wanted to be citizens, but I mean, here's a lot of people saying, and all the transcendentalists are writing at the re-anniversary, right? The 100th year, it's the anniversary of the American Revolution. And they're saying, are we lost? Can we revolutionize again? But what's really happening, they're seeing, is that we're making a pact, a super big pact with the devil to lock in slavery and to lock in, even after the war, to keep something going that's not good. And so I think that, one of the things with the Trump thing is, for me was, oh, right, a New York real estate developer's president. That, it's kind of not surprising, but that's of course can be debatable. Maybe it is surprising to people, but Thoreau again doesn't buy a farm. He sets up in a woodlot. And by the way, the woodlot is really valuable as fuel source. So that's a complicated thing too. But anyway, I still think he's George.
Or Pete Best. I think he might be Pete Best, actually.
I did want to ask Gerald what also, because James and I talk a lot about the Beatles when we're not talking about the transcendentalists, if I could say that publicly. Which song did you write about?
Oh, I'm a Loser.
Oh, really?
Ah, yes.
I didn't know that.
That was far and away my favorite song growing up from the Beatles. And one of the reasons I wanted to be in when Andrew approached me was, I said, oh, I really would like to write about that song. And then the other thing was, I bet you no one else in the book is going to write about that song.
You were right. For that book, 3 different people wanted to write about "And Your Bird Can Sing," which is which I think was the title of the Beatles TV show, if you remember that at all. So, and just to address one point, as far as how many lives Thoreau is going to have, there will at least be one more major cycle in our lifetime. I think Richard Linklater, who made the movie Boyhood, he's made several big movies, is making a feature about Thoreau, and I think Ken Burns is also executive producing another sort of Thoreauvian movie. Yes.
Really?
So, without.
Yeah, and Ethan Hawke is playing Emerson in that movie,
Really?
Fact?
in the Richard Linklater movie.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Really?
I don't know what to say about that, but what are you gonna do?
Oh, James, also, I wanted to mention, I think that your mantra on the line from Thoreau that you mentioned that was of some ballast or succor to you, I think was invoked by Congressman John Lewis in his own book not long before he died.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's wonderful to hear.
Double check that, but I'm reasonably sure. I mean, you always hear when you first start researching Thoreau again, one, you're not sure how to pronounce whether it's Thoreau or Thorough, and you discover he was not born Henry David Thoreau, he was born David Henry Thoreau, but you also immediately learn that he influenced, you always see this holy trinity of like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and John F. Kennedy, and then mentions Tolstoy and lots of other writers, but the ripples are obviously current to this day. It begs the question to me, maybe it's rhetorical, maybe it's obvious, 50, 100 years from now, are kids going to be reading Thoreau and Walden in 7th grade or 9th grade? Is he still going to be considered relevant and resonant? And the other sort of companion question that's come up in the course of this project is there anyone alive, working, writing, thinking today who's sort of our modern day equivalent? If anyone wants to touch that, that's fine. The name that's come up is Terry Tempest Williams. But even then it's sort of ghettoized because people will say she's sort of a female Thoreau, which is sort of Mrs.
Who doesn't want to be described that way? No, I think there's a strong tributary of, loosely speaking, transcendentalist writing, and more narrowly, I guess, defined as Thoreauvian or Emersonian. I mean, I certainly think Annie Dillard comes out of, I hate to say comes out of, because it seems to sort of narrow her as a writer, but I mean, she is totally operating in a transcendentalist tradition. And I think as a writer of fiction, so is Marilyn Robinson. I think, Gilead and the books that came after it have a very strong transcendentalist feel to them, just in their rhetoric and also in what they're about. So I don't know, but I'd be curious to hear what the two of you think would be the inheritors of Thoreau in some way in contemporary American culture or in writing.
Gerald, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking around for a book of poetry. I have an anthology. I guess I think of Thoreau in smaller doses, like the Thoreau, if I'm thinking of like who's being Thoreau. I guess I would like point to a bunch of poems where I think, okay, here's Thoreau now. I guess one of the things is, it might be an artist. It might be somebody working in another medium because I mean, if you think literally about the poetics or literally about the metaphor, which is a mistake. And of course, Emerson's big complaint to Thoreau was you're using words next to each other that shouldn't be, like, you can't say literal and metaphorical next to it. But if you think literally about it, like, you got to find somebody who is taking all of this junk that is the way we talk and communicate to each other, the kind of the spectacle of every day, like, posting oneself, like, I just ate lunch. He's got to do all that, or she or they has to take it all. If one is to kind of meet the challenge of Walden, which I think one can do. And like I say, it might be art, it might be with something else, but there is that a frequent line that gives me succor, I guess, is when Thoreau says something like, use your appliances, don't let them use you. And that is, I find it to be super helpful. And so yeah, so you kind of was like, oh, he would tweet and all, or he would what, you're immediately into mediums, and what mediums would we be talking about here, and how do mediums go? And so I think it's better just to think about that and not not necessarily answer it or come up with new answers each time. That's what I would say.
It's probably a silly, unfair question along on the continuum of like the Today Show riff. It almost sort of gets, although you remind me when we did the Peanuts book and the question came up about Charles Schultz, people didn't, and so who's sort of inheriting, carrying the torch, or most similar, it wasn't another cartoonist. The name that came up the most was Fred Rogers. And that was more about sensibility. And I think it's sort of to your point and not being so literal about looking. I mean, why look at who's inheriting it, the mantle anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for mantles. Oh, I'll say that.
You're pro mantles is what you're saying.
Pro mantle. Oh, and that's the other big joke in Walden is I enjoy a broad margin to my life. Like he's even making fun of the pages that he's on while he's making the fun about the extra vagrant.
When I was started my teaching career, I taught Walden pretty often because I had to teach this class in Great American Literature, and that was one of the. Actually, the books were more or less assigned. I had to do Huck Finn and Portrait of a Lady, and I did Walden, and the students at this time, this was back in the 90s, they were not. They were not that interested. They were not that into Thoreau as they might be today, or something like that, with the environmentalism and everything. And so it was not that easy to get them through the book. And I remember one of the things I tried to tell them was that, this book is actually pretty funny, and they didn't believe me. They absolutely did not believe me.
That's hysterical.
Funny.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I was going to think about an artist, not a writer, but an artist who kind of represented for a time a kind of Thoreauvian impulse, or I think had a kind of Thoreauvian sort of attraction to people. It would be the jazz pianist Keith Jarrett. In thinking about his music, particularly the solo concerts and everything, and the kind of self-sufficiency of it, and the kind of cantankerousness he sort of had about being with jazz but not being a part of it. His persona, if I was going to think of an artist who kind of had an appeal like that, it would be him.
Oh, it's fascinating.
From Bethlehem, PA, right? No.
Yeah, from
Bethlehem.
No, Allentown.
Allentown. Okay, sorry. PA based.
Yeah, Allentown. But he would be the person who come to mind. I'm thinking of an artist that for a time had a kind of Thoreauvian sort of appeal.
That's right. That's That
I mean, it's funny if you take one strand of it, the Thoreauvian bit about not getting to the end of your life and discovering that you've never actually lived. I mean, the leap from there to there, from basically my favorite novel of the last 50 years, 100 years maybe, was a book called The Spectator Bird, which was by Wallace Stegner, which won the National Book Award, but sort of weirdly, very few people I find, even well-read people, far better read than I have, haven't read it, haven't heard of it. But it speaks to that kind of, you talk about new age messaging, like there are different ways to sort of communicate that message. Let us not get to the end of your life and find you haven't actually lived. Who couldn't relate to that? Maybe when you're really young, you can't relate to it as well as maybe some of us, and maybe during a pandemic, you relate to it a little bit more intimately or intensely. So,
well, I wanted to, Wallace Stegner, amazing. I wanted to add with the Keith Jarrett thing, a song that also, like, I kept playing when it get really depressing during the COVID, although it's still going, so it's still really depressing. There's the song with the European Quartet, "Long as You Know You're Living Yours."
Yeah.
Anybody, if I was coordinated enough to add that into the chat right now, I would do that. That's all I want to say.
Yeah.
But if you try, you'll blow the whole thing up, Bob. So
Right, exactly. Like, yeah. It'll show you my mother doing my laundry. Sorry.
and speaking of the chat, if anyone has, and we've been sort of amusing or engaging ourselves. If anyone has,
Jeez,
if I have missed anything.
chat negligent.
I don't think anything's come up in the chat I've been watching, but
Okay.
if anyone does, we have just a couple more minutes.
I mean, in that time, I don't know why, but I just feel compelled to mention that one of the other sort of gateways for me to sort of commit to doing this project was the more that I learned about I foreshadowed this a little bit, the relationship with his brother was just so, it seems so relatively unknown, despite the fact that he basically wrote an entire book about him. And it's not a fact or fiction thing, but the fact that he identified so much with him. And again, maybe James, I'll put this on you to sort of true or false, that there were these, I don't know if they were called simpatico sympathy pains that his brother developed. Was it lockjaw?
His brother developed lockjaw and died of it.
And then Henry
Also developed the
became
symptoms of lockjaw.
symptomatic.
Yeah, and he didn't have it. Luckily, he recovered. But I think you're right that was a token of an intense fraternal identification there. And his peers were very frightened that he was going to die of the same thing, because he was showing all of the symptoms, but luckily they faded and he survived. But yeah, that was a
He
a
survived.
very close sibling relationship, and a terrible blow for him when he lost his brother.
An ineffable blow, right? I mean, and Emerson lost a child. Is that
Emerson
right?
lost his 5-year-old son Waldo right around the same time, so they
Right.
both had a terrible bereavement right around the same time. And I think that they were already quite close, but I think that made them closer, actually.
And in fact, you mentioned, and someone mentioned Annie Dillard, Bob Richardson, Annie's late husband, great biographer of Thoreau and Emerson, has a
Mhm.
book coming out next year, posthumously, also from Princeton, about William James, Emerson, and Thoreau, and how they all overcame tragedy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm really looking forward to reading that. And he knows those lives inside out.
Hmm.
And he was a wonderful writer. So I'm really looking forward to reading that book.
Yeah, that's one of the best, the Thoreau book, his writing about Richardson's writing is, yeah. And when Gerald was talking about like healing, like going Thoreau and healing, I was thinking too about all this horrible stuff that happened with his brother and the closeness and the death, but also again, everybody's got tuberculosis. There's so much tuberculosis, and people are dying, and people are leaving the town, and it's about people going away. But also he's witness to this horrible explosion at a nearby factory, and he comes upon all the mass of dead, and also he's often attacked by Irish historians, academics, for the beginning of Cape Cod, where he talks about the dead bodies in a ship that's come aground, and it's actually a famine ship. So people are fleeing, are being thrown on boats, starving, and here they are dead on the water. And they say he does it with this, he doesn't care about it. He calls her Bridget so-and-so. But in fact, I read it as this, intense being with, like the intensity that we see in when James is talking about him. He's a burning body, and when he sees this horror, he describes it in this almost like coroner's like way, like he's using style to say something here, something about how you can't describe the horror. So anyway, let's end on that right now. All right. What Keith Jarrett, that's really where Keith Jarrett.
All right. Well, I want to, again, thank Susan Glassman, everybody at the Wagner, the entire audience out there, all of the contributors, especially the three with us tonight, and Princeton University Press for making this book a reality. So if there's nothing more, Susan, back to you.
Yep, I just want to thank all four of you for joining us, and maybe particularly Robert Sullivan for thinking of the Wagner, putting us on the circuit. We're really thrilled to have you. I think you managed to present the incredible range and the tentacles and the way Thoreau reverberates and resonates, and has so much contemporary power, but that doesn't seem to go away and keeps cycling back. So I want to end by recommending the book, which I've read, not all of, but key parts. And we're dropping in the chat that you can get a discount if you get it directly from Princeton University Press by the end of the calendar year. There's a link with the code, and then you can get it at the Wagner. Thank you for holding that up. Where we will have signed copies as of next week. Thank you, Robert Sullivan. And come visit us at the Wagner as well. We'd be happy to see all of you, including all of our speakers. We really would love it if you would come visit. So thank you and good night, everyone. And thanks again for joining us for this program.